Welcome to Broadway Drumming 101. My guest today is Ryan McCausland. How are you?
I'm good. How are you? Thanks so much for having me.
I'm glad that you could be on the podcast. I've been following your Instagram posts and seeing that you're doing so many different things. And it kind of reminds me of what I heard about when Sean McDaniel first came into the city. He was playing on a bunch of shows and everybody's talking about him. Maybe it's just me. I'm just learning about you.
It's funny. I would never really compare myself to Sean at all, but Gary Seligson, I met him when I was on a layoff, and he had actually said the same thing. He's like, you kind of remind me of Sean when you came. He came in and just started subbing on a whole bunch of things all at once, and I was like, well, that's really flattering. Like,
Well, I'm glad you could be here. Were you born in LA?
no, so I actually grew up in southern New Jersey.
Oh, really?
My parents moved to LA. My mom's side of the family is all West Coasters. Around the time I graduated college, they started transitioning to the West Coast so that my mom could be closer to her family. My dad's side of the family is all East Coast. So, for the first part of their lives, we spent, growing up in New Jersey. And then after me and my sister were finished with college, they moved out to Southern California.
You spend much time out there?
I spent the whole pandemic out there with them.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's a beautiful place. They live in La Quinta, which is a couple towns away from Palm Springs. So they're in a sort of retirement community. It was honestly, of all the places to spend such a brutal part of life, it was a really beautiful place to be. Just getting to spend time with my family for that long, seeing as we were on tour for so long, it was really great. It's a type of place where weather will never affect your plans. If you wanted to go hiking, it was about 100% possible because it was usually sunny and beautiful.
The older I get, the more I want to be around weather like that. When it's cold and rainy and not sunny, I get really depressed.
I'm in a wonderful mood today for many reasons, but it's a gorgeous day outside. I know that affects my personality all the time.
So, growing up in New Jersey, do you remember what your first musical memory was?
Well, I think a lot of my playing journey started through church. My parents took us to this Methodist church, and that's where I saw the drummer playing on stage in this contemporary worship set. I was like, oh, that looks like a lot of fun. After the service, I went up and started asking him a whole bunch of questions, and I sat behind the kid and started playing, and he turned to my parents and was like, he has some natural talent for this. Like, you should consider, but my parents are both music teachers. So,
Ah,
they basically took that and ran with it. But that's really where I started playing and finding out that I had somewhat of a natural talent for drums.
do they play drums at all? Either one?
They're both vocalists, actually. My dad plays a little bit of acoustic guitar, but they were both choral directors. My mom was general education music teacher and then a middle school choral teacher, and my dad did high school. For a while, they were teaching in the same district, so the kids would start with my mom and go all the way through high school and work with my dad, which is kind of wild.
Do you sing at all? Did you play in your church choir?
I did. Yeah. I played a little bit with the adult worship team and then a youth group worship team. I did that for a bit until high school, and a lot of high school activities started conflicting. I started doing a lot more stuff at school because it was around that time that I realized I wanted to do it more.
Did you see yourself 10 years down the road playing shows, or did you have other plans in your life other than being a musician?
There was a pivotal moment where I knew that I wanted to do it. It was about the same time I knew that I wanted to do Broadway and pursue music professionally. It was around freshman year of high school. My sister wanted to go see Wicked, her favorite show. So for Christmas, my parents took us as a group up to New York. I'm pretty sure it was the day after Christmas. We all went up to New York and saw Wicked. I had not really heard the music before that, but as we're driving all the way up there, I'm listening to it. I'm like, oh my God, this is such a cool drum book. When I saw the show, we got to intermission and I was like, yep. I remember turning to my mom and saying, that's what I want to do. I want to play on Broadway. I didn't think she was paying that much attention. Just kids say things all the time to their parents, and but she logged that away. And, she and my dad go to this music educators convention in New Jersey, which was in New Brunswick at the time. A couple months later, she and my dad were in this choral workshop, and they have an accompanist come in and play through all of the arrangements. And that happened to be Ben Cohen. When they announced him, they said that he was working as one of the conductors over at Wicked. After the workshop was done, my mom went up to Ben and said, my son wants to do Broadway. Do you have any advice for him? He handed her his business card. He said, have him email me with any questions. If he ever wanted to come and watch in the pit, we could make that happen. I remember she called me later that night and I just flipped out. That was not something on my radar. Like going and watching in a Broadway pit wasn't something that I ever thought was possible. I was very stoked for that. So around that summer, I went in and I watched Matt play at Wicked.
Matt Vanderin.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think I was 15 years old at the time.
Wow. That's cool. I've never seen the show and I've never watched Matt play. Every time I tried to go and watch him, I wound up getting a gig or a show. So maybe I should ask him tomorrow.
But he's amazing. And it's a lot more comfortable now because when I watched him when I was 15, he was still in the pit. Over the course of the pandemic, they were trying to spread people out. I think everyone used to be in the pit. And during the pandemic, they moved Matt up into the harp room beside the percussionist. And then they moved the harp into the pit. And then I think they moved a couple of the keyboards out of the pit as well. So it's a little bit more comfortable in the pit now. But if I'm reading Matt correctly, I think he misses being in the pit with everyone else. A lot of people miss it too because you can kind of feel the drums a different way when they're like right with you rather than being up in a room completely remote. But I hear it sounds better because they can control more things.
So in your experience, this is kind of like on a deeper level of playing shows. In your experience, either being on tour or just having a show of your own or being in a pit, do you prefer to be around other musicians when you're playing or do you mind being remote?
I definitely prefer being in the pit with people, but I think that the caveat being I would like to have the enclosure as well. Hamilton's kind of the best of both worlds because he is built into the pit, but he has this whole third of the pit that's walled off. He doesn't have to worry about noise bleed, but you're still with everybody else and you can actually see the conductor with your own eyes and you can feel everything happening and hear the audience, which is such a huge thing for me. Most of my playing experience with Broadway shows has been remote. Dear Evan Hansen was all remote. When I was subbing on the Britney Spears musical for Rich, that was remote. Wicked is now remote. The only time I've actually played in a pit on Broadway was Hamilton. That was a really special experience to be able to hear the audience like right on top of you.
Speaking of playing with others, when did you start when you were young? Was it in the church setting or in junior high and high school?
I started in church and then migrated to more activities in school. I got really invested in the marching band, the jazz ensembles, and the pit orchestra at high school. Pretty much any ensemble I could get my hands on, I was all about because music became my identity in high school. All of my friends were in the arts programs. Even today, most of the people I spend time with are artists and people I work with in orchestras and bands all over the place.
What made you want to go to Montclair State?
There was an upperclassman who went to the school and mentioned they had a really good theater program. And then they also were building like a new music school at the same time. I was looking between a few schools at the time. One of them was Rowan University with Dean Witten, and the other was Montclair with Barry Santani. I wound up going to Montclair because I really connected with Barry as a teacher, and I knew they had such a strong theater program and that they had students participate in the orchestra. So that really, it was also nice to get closer to New York because Rowan was very much in my hometown area. It wasn't too far away from what I knew. Montclair was like a little bit uncomfortable in a good way. It sort of got me away from where I was, but not too far away, close to New York, but not in New York.
When you were starting to play drums, were there any drummers that you looked up to either on YouTube or on records or CDs or MP3s?
So two that come to mind are Dave Garibaldi and Carter Beauford because I was a huge Tower Power fan and Dave Matthews Band fan. So I was listening to them constantly. Another would be Liberty DeVito because I was a big Billy Joel fan. That was something I bonded with my grandmother on. The list continues to grow. After college, I started getting into jazz, an area of drums that I didn't get to explore a lot. Getting to listen to Peter Erskine, Louis Nash, and contemporary jazz with Dave Weckl. The list just continues to grow. Snarky Puppy blowing my mind with Lorna Lewis. It's a list that is extensive. I could probably spend the rest of the podcast talking about people that I love to listen to.
If you were to put on a recording of somebody right now to get inspiration and just to remember the joy of playing drums, who would it be? And what song?
I mean, I was over at the gym the other day, and like I think a Snarky Puppy song came on with Lauren L. Lewis playing. It was from the album We Like It Here.
What
Um,
about me?
I love that tune. I want to say Shofu Khan was the one that came on.
Mm,
It was him and the percussionist trading these insanely tight grooves towards the end, and I was like, oh my god, that's just incredible. It's like a machine. To think that two human beings are that in sync
mm.
is just amazing, and I always find that inspiring. That whole album I find to be really inspiring.
It's really, really good. I was just on the I was just speaking with Skylar about his influences, and he said the same thing about Lauren L. Lewis.
Mhm.
We talked about What About Me. I got to listen to Shofu Khan is
I
the name
think
of
the first song on that album, I think,
and Link.
and like
Yeah, I got to listen to that again. But yeah, that's great. I need to maybe after this go ahead and listen to that. Is it the beginning of Shofu Khan or the end?
it's sort of the end that
Okay.
really builds. I mean, the whole groove is really great, but towards the end is where they're really building this breakdown where the percussionist and the drummer just sort of doing this crazy groove back and forth over this ostinato.
Going to college to study music, did you always have an idea that you wanted to be on Broadway when you were, was the ultimate goal Broadway or just to become a professional musician in any context? Or were you like, Broadway is the only thing I want to do?
When I went into school, it was very much the latter. Like Broadway was what I wanted to do. Music school was a means to an end. It was like, I'm going to come here, study music, and then go right to New York, and it's all going to work out. But that obviously didn't. When I went into school, that was exactly what I wanted to do. After I graduated college, that's sort of when my mindset became to broaden a lot in terms of I didn't just, it wasn't necessarily a Broadway or bust mentality after that. It was very much I just want to play music. That's sort of where it led me to doing a lot of cruise ship work because those were gigs that I didn't necessarily see myself doing at all when I was in college, but was, through sheer force of just needing to survive, started to become things that I considered after school. I'm so glad that it worked out that way because I had such a great time working this gig.
So tell me more about the cruise ship experience and how did you wind up applying? How do you apply and get the gig? And what's a typical cruise ship gig like?
I started considering it once I come out of school and I was doing a lot of work up and down, like a lot of summer stock work at theaters. But there was a point in time where I was doing substitute teaching as well. And I was looking at a summer where there was no work. And I was thinking, what are other things that I could consider? And I went to, I think Playbill has like a jobs posting site, and there was one for Carnival Cruise Lines. I think, oh, okay, that might be something I could consider. My parents and I had been on a cruise before. I was the only one in the family that didn't enjoy it. So I guess it was subconsciously something I wasn't really considering because it wasn't something I enjoyed vacationing on. I didn't have a horrible time, but it didn't really gel with me like it did with my family. But I went, they had a sort of a open audition at, I think it was Sir Studios in New York for the show band. So they were looking for people that were going to play along with the production shows and be a general band for any of the fly-on acts that came on. I went in there and auditioned. The guy got in touch with me and said, okay, you've made it. It was a couple months later that they found a short-term fill at Carnival. I went on there and I really didn't enjoy it very much. The production shows were built in such a way where they utilized a lot of tracks, but they weren't like filler tracks. You were playing along with a track, and there was a drum track that you were also playing along to. It just felt very not what I wanted to do. It's like, this seems ridiculous. Why not just use tracks the whole time? So I didn't stay with Carnival after that. A lot of my friends recommended keep doing it. I think this was a fluke. Try it with a different line. So I joined an agency called Lime, and they put me on a Royal Caribbean ship that went out of Asia. I figured if I don't enjoy cruising on the ship, at least I'll get to see Singapore and Hong Kong and places that I wouldn't see otherwise. I went out there and I had an amazing time. One of the most incredible experiences was doing that first ship with Royal Caribbean because it was the only ship I did a full 7-month contract on. I met some of the most incredible musicians from all over the world. We were working on a lot of jazz and contemporary jazz, things I wouldn't have gotten a chance to play at Montclair or anywhere else with people that good. It was a huge growing experience for me because we're out in the middle of the ocean and there was just plenty of space and freedom to try things and really grow as a musician. I had a great time out there. I wound up working for Royal Caribbean for about 2.5 years. I come from a background of theater, and I know that Royal Caribbean does book musicals, like real shows on the ship. Do you think you could find one for me? And he says, maybe. Towards the end of my contract on the first ship, he said, well, I've got one for you. It's 3-month fill on the Allure of the Season. They're playing Mamma Mia. I was like, great. That sounds awesome. So the next ship I took was Mamma Mia. And what I didn't realize at the time is that the people at Mamma Mia are very strict about what they allow you to do with the show. So when they licensed it to Royal Caribbean, they said you have to do it with 5 live musicians or you can't do the show. You have to do the whole 2.5 hour show. There's got to be a 15-minute intermission in between. Nothing can change. It has to be exactly the same, which is really cool to do on a cruise ship because sometimes things are shortened and you get a light version of what it would be on Broadway, but not with Mamma Mia. It was exactly what it would be. That was a really cool experience because it connected me with Derek Stoltenberg. We hadn't met at all, but we'd heard about each other. We got in touch because he had played the tour of Mamma Mia and I was playing on the ship. We connected because we were like, hey, you played Mamma Mia, I played Mamma Mia. Later on, we got to meet in person. The funny thing, it was the first time I played on electric drums for a musical. Because mostly it was acoustic drums up to that point. It was one of the first full musicals that I played on a full electric set, which was a learning experience.
So after the cruise ship thing, you started doing some touring, like with Dirty Dancing. Is that what happened next?
Yeah, during the ship, I did a couple more with one of the smaller companies with Royal Caribbean. I was dating a girl from London at the time. The plan for me was wildly different. I was head over heels for this girl. I was going to move to London, do the West End thing instead, the Broadway thing. That didn't work out. So when I came, like the whole relationship ended while I was on the contract. Something about that pivoted me into thinking about going in a different direction. I think I was going to continue working on ships, but I didn't really want to do that anymore. As I got to the end of that contract, I started looking for other things to do. And I auditioned for, I think it was the second tour of Kinky Boots, or maybe the third tour, I can't remember. And I didn't get it. I remember thinking I was going to go back to ships, but I saw a posting for Dirty Dancing at the theater by my parents' place in Southern California. And it was right next to Kinky Boots. They were on the same season that time. I remember seeing something on Playbill about them needing musicians for Dirty Dancing. I remember before going back to the East Coast, I wrote to John Mezzio. I said, hey, it was the most flippant email I think I've ever written to a contractor. It was like, hey, I saw this posting. I know you probably don't need anyone, but if you're looking, I'm still available. Thanks, Ryan. And then just sent it off and forgot about it. A couple days after I got home, I was looking into going back on another cruise ship out of Singapore. And they were finalizing that whole thing. I got an email from John and he says, hey, are you interested in Dirty Dancing? I said, yeah, but I don't have any access to hand drums to audition. He says, no. He's like, you have the gig. Do you want it or not? I was like, well, yeah. So I bailed on the cruise ship gig and went out with Dirty Dancing. That was another amazing thing that put me in touch with one of my best friends, Kevin McNaughton, the drummer on the tour. I was playing percussion, which I hadn't really done in a while. I didn't have a lot of formal hand drum training. It was a crash course of learning what I needed to play some simple conga and bongo grooves for Dirty Dancing before we went out. That was an adventure of a tour. It was the first and only non-equity tour that I ever did. And it was about as non-equity as they come. It was a non-union contract. It wasn't protected by any of the AFM, Actors Equity, or AOTC guidelines. You negotiated these contracts through the producer, and they usually weren't very good. I think I looked at the contract recently. I was making somewhere in the neighborhood of $450 a week and a $500 per diem. And we were paying for our hotels out of the per diem. So we were living together. Sometimes there were actors living 3 and 4 to a room to save money. It was a very bleak existence. We were touring Dirty Dancing. I think back fondly on that because it gave me a perspective I wouldn't have had otherwise about what touring can be like. I'm really grateful that I had that experience before I went to Dear Evan Hansen because that was almost the other end of the spectrum. It also put me in touch with such good people. The truth about Dirty Dancing is that it's a dreadful show. It's not really that good at all, but the people working on it were very good. There's only so much you can do with a show that's really not great. The movie's wonderful, but the show was pretty much just the movie, but worse. And there wasn't really much of an adaptation to it. We were making the best of the situation, and it was a lot of really good people in an environment that wasn't always the best. And for that, I'm really thankful.
Sometimes if you start from the bottom and work in bad conditions, and then you get a job where you're working in great conditions, you kind of appreciate it more. Great people, great musicians. At least on a tour, you know you have a job for a long
Mhm.
period of time. As opposed to Broadway, you get a gig. You're like, I got a Broadway gig, then it closes in a month. So that's like a big difference. Except if you have a show like Book of Mormon, Hamilton, or Lion King, you kind of know you're going to be there for a while.
The Dear Evan Hansen tour was incredible. It was the first major league gig I've ever done. And getting to be a part of that still feels a bit shocking just because of how amazing it was to get called for that.
So how did you get that one?
That story kind of connects to the first one where I met Ben Cohn. Ben and I had been keeping in touch and pen paling. Every time I come to the city, I try and get in touch with him. And I remember we were coming to the end of Dirty Dancing, and I knew that I wanted to keep touring. The only thing that I really knew I wanted to do that was going to continue touring was the second tour of Finding Neverland. Because that was a drum set book. And I was like, well, I don't want to keep doing hand percussion because it's not really my forte. It's not really something I feel I'm best at. I would really like to transition to a drum set book. And I knew they had that one going out. So I thought that there was a really good chance that I could get onto that tour because I knew Greg German and I had watched him play the tour when they were on the Equity Tour. And then, I had studied with Joe Hershevsky when I was in college and right out of college. I watched him play after he took it over for Rich. I was like, okay, I'm familiar with the show. I know a few people that were on there. I was devastated to find out later on that I wasn't picked and they found another person. It got me thinking, I know Ben's playing this new show, Dear Evan Hansen, in New York, and I hadn't really heard much about it. Then we have this layoff over Christmas. Let me get back in touch with him. As I'm driving up to meet Ben and watch Jamie play the show, I'm listening to some of this music and I'm thinking, oh my God, this isn't just music that I like. It's actually music I think I could perform really well. I think it sits really well in what I do. Getting to connect with Jamie and meet up with Ben again after a long time was amazing. Just getting a chance to watch the show. I loved it. I loved the drum book. But I had this sort of sinking feeling as I walked away from that going, there's no way that I'm going to be picked for this show. It won a Tony Award. It was larger than life. It was just such a big deal in that moment that I was like, there's no way that I'm going to be the type of person for this. But I shot my shot and I said to Ben, if you're looking for people for the tour, let me know. He said, I'll put you on the list to audition. Black had prepared these audition packets.
Before you go on, talking about Jamie Eblin, for people that don't know Jamie, and Lack is Alex Lackamore.
Yeah. Sorry, I feel like everyone's in my own head when I'm talking about this. Jamie Eblin was the original drummer on Dear Evan Hansen. When I went to watch it, he was the person that I met. So before Jake Goldboss took over, Jamie was playing. Watching Jamie play that book was amazing. Jamie has a way of playing that just seems very effortless and laid back. All of the types of things that remind me of his personality, which is pretty wonderful. I got to watch Jamie play, and then they put me on the list. I remember it was a series of events that just happened to work out perfectly. We were on a week-long layoff from Dirty Dancing. My parents were in the midst of moving out to California. Our house in South Jersey was kind of abandoned. Most of their stuff had been moved. It looked like a house that the Grinch robbed. Just empty with wire and hooks. And there was just my drums that were sitting in there. We were ending the tour that time. I think it was Binghamton, New York. When I was going to go home, they rented me a car. The day before that, Mike Aarons had reached out and said, here's all the audition materials for Dear Evan Hansen. I had that whole week just to shed Dear Evan Hansen. So I went home and I was basically just alone in my house, living like a monk, eating, sleeping, and breathing Dear Evan Hansen. It was great because I got to, I woke up and I played through all this stuff and got frustrated and started hurling sticks at the wall because things were going well. And, it was a whole journey that week. I was a bit of an idiot because I was very nervous. And I remember one of the things that I took a little bit too much to heart was Black had said in the material, he said, we want to make sure that, it's just you playing along to a click track. We don't want to hear anything else. You're not going to play along to the cast recording or anything. We just want to hear you and the click. And I'm like, okay, great. And we don't want you to doctor anything. Just play it straight through. So don't punch in notes or anything like that. I took that to mean they wanted the audition done all in one take. I got it into my head where I had to play the whole 9-minute audition straight. So I built this click track that went straight down and started running these things over and over again. And I drove myself crazy because if one thing went wrong in the fourth tune, you had to start all over again. I don't know why I did this. Nobody else did this. I remember telling everybody else, why are you making it so hard? But I managed to do it. I got the whole thing done. And it was, I think I had a 8 a.m. flight to Montana the next day to rejoin Dirty Dancing. And I finished recording, I think at 11:30 or like midnight. And I didn't even have any time to just put it together. Just like threw the materials onto my laptop and packed up the drums and went to sleep and headed to the airport. I remember sitting in a Starbucks next to the hotel in Montana, putting together this video and sending it out to Mike Aarons and thinking I'll probably never hear from him again. A week later, he calls me and says, "Hey, Alex Lacamoire and Ben Cohn liked the video. They want to get onto a Zoom with you. When do you think you'd be available?" And I said, I was so shocked that this was happening. I was, anytime, So the only time that Lac and Ben had together, I think, was like 6 a.m. I was in Mountain Time, so it was 5 a.m. for me. And I remember waking up at 5 a.m. I knew Ben very well, but I'd never met Lac, and I was very intimidated. It was 5 a.m, and I'm like crammed in this little Holiday Inn, like office area, in Canada, and having this conversation with Lac for the first time, who was very nice, but still very intimidating. He was talking about what was going on this tour and how I was enjoying it, and that he really liked the audition. And he said to me, "Very impressive that you did the whole thing in one take." And I said, "Oh, yeah." He's like, "Yeah, you didn't have to do that. That's very impressive. Thanks." And then I'll never forget the way he ended that conversation. He's like, "Hey, Ryan, I have a question for you. I'm not really used to the Google Hangouts situation, but if you hang up, can Ben and I still talk?" And I remember thinking, "Yeah, I think so." He's like, "Okay, well, why don't you go ahead and do that?" And I was like, "Okay, bye." And then I hung up knowing full well that they were just discussing me somewhere. I was like, "Oh God, what are they saying? Bad did this go?" I blew it. I remember telling that to Kevin. I was beside myself with worry for the next 5 or 6 days. I didn't hear anything. I didn't hear from Mike. I didn't hear from Ben. I didn't hear from Lac. I heard nothing. And I was a wreck. Then we were in Schenectady, and I was sitting on my bed, and I got an email from Mike Aarons. He said, "Congratulations. We want to offer you the tour." Time basically stopped. I called my mom first. She didn't answer. And so I called my dad. He was the first person to know that I got the tour, and that was amazing. I remember telling everyone in the band that night, and I remember our bass player was like, "Wow, there's not two ends of the spectrum you could probably jump to from Dirty Dancing to Dear Evan Hansen."
That's a great story. So, Dear, you got the first national tour of that show.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. Did you ever sub on Broadway before that?
I had never subbed on Broadway, but that actually was the catalyst for the first time I did. I was preparing to go out on Dear Evan Hansen. I started getting all my ducks in a row. I got a text from Jamie. He said, "Congrats on the tour. So happy for you." He's like, "By the way, if you want to cover a couple of shows for me in New York before you head out, love to have you." It was good news on top of good news. I was struggling to figure out whether or not this was real life. I was like, "Absolutely, I'd love to." It just so happened that they put me up in a hotel in New York for the last 2 weeks of their rehearsals so that they could have drums and piano at the same time at this rehearsal space. That was where I got to meet Lac and Justin Paul in person, two of the most intense people I've ever played drums for. While I was up there, Jamie said, "Hey, how about Sunday?" And I think it was the Sunday of the second week that I went and I played Dear Evan Hansen on Broadway. That was my Broadway debut. It was the first time I'd ever played on Broadway, and it was simultaneously the most comfortable I think you could ever be playing your first Broadway show, because it didn't really feel like subbing. It felt like, because I'd known the show and I've been playing rehearsals for it. So people were like, "Oh, you subbed on Broadway." I'm just like, "Yes," but I almost felt like this sort of a sense of imposter syndrome. It didn't feel like a true blue subbing experience because it was a book that I was already going to play on tour. But it was still very nerve-wracking, and it was the first time I'd ever played a performance of the show. And I remember very little of it. I remember walking into the stage door, going up to the drum nest, and then coming down the ladder after the show. I don't really remember much of anything in between. I just remember my hands being very, very sweaty.
To continue producing the high-quality podcast you're listening to, publishing engaging newsletter content, and posting YouTube videos, we would appreciate any financial contributions you can make. At this time, we have no advertisers, and we'd like to keep it that way. Our staff is small but growing. We can only produce the show with listener contributions from people like you. There are a couple of ways you can do that. You can sign up to be a monthly or annual subscriber at BroadwayDrumming101.com. You can also contribute any amount you wish through PayPal at paypal.me/Broadway Drumming 101 or through Venmo at Broadway Drumming 101. Or help keep us caffeinated by buying us a cup of coffee or a week's worth at buymeacoffee.com/BD101. That's buymeacoffee.com/BD101. We appreciate any support you can give. Don't forget to subscribe to the Broadway Drumming 101 YouTube page. You'll find more content that isn't featured on the podcast or on the Broadway Drumming 101 Instagram page. Make sure when you subscribe to the YouTube page, you click on the button to be notified when a new video is published. Thanks again for listening to the Broadway Drumming 101 podcast.
So after that, you went on the tour. How long did the tour last?
So we started in 2018 in the fall, and we went all the way to March of 2020 for the pandemic.
Okay.
I think about Dear Evan Hansen kind of in like 3 different periods. You have like your Act 1 period where it was about 18 months on, and then we had the months off because of the pandemic. We did a relaunch in 2021, and we did almost an equal amount of time as the first part, which is like 19 months, and then we closed. So it was a 5-year span, but we didn't play for a lot of that because we were out for the pandemic. It was about 3 years of playing the show.
You came back, and did you start subbing on that show, or did you do something else in New York? Yeah.
When we closed last summer, it was kind of crazy. Ben was working on the new Britney Spears show, Once Upon a One More Time.
Mm-hmm.
I think we were in Pittsburgh, and Rich reached out to me by email. He said, "Hey, Ben Cohn's been talking to me about subs, and your name came up first. Would love to have you learn the book." And I said, "Yes, that would be so cool." Because after 1,100 shows of Dear Evan Hansen, it was nice to work on anything that wasn't Dear Evan Hansen. He sent me the materials, but it was a new show, so they came pretty late because things were changing constantly. So I started working on that almost to the minute Dear Evan Hansen was done. I transitioned immediately into working on that show. I moved into Brooklyn, set up the drum space, and went to work on Britney Spears. That was such a fun show to play. I think I knew even then it's probably not going to be a show that's going to stick around for a while, but it was so much fun to learn, and it was such a supportive environment. Vivi Rama was on bass, and she's like a legend. Ben was conducting, and getting a chance to watch Rich play was incredible. He has such a huge sound, but when you watch him play, it almost doesn't seem like he's working that hard to get it. It's just this really heavy, Titanic type sound that comes from the drums, and he's not even really hitting that hard. He was really cool to watch, and I only got to play that show once before it closed, which was a bit of a bummer because it was a lot of prep for something that didn't last long enough to get in again. But I am so grateful that I got to do it because it was only the second show that I'd ever subbed on Broadway. That actually eliminated a little bit of imposter syndrome that I had. It's like, okay, now like this was a subbing show. Like you came in, you learned this show. It wasn't yours. You had the couple of weeks to learn it, and then you played it. I felt more like a sub rather than someone who was playing their own show on Broadway.
Being on tour for so long, were you aware of the fact that you could get injured from playing the same thing the same way? Is there something that you did to help avoid drumming injuries?
I think it was about 4 months into playing the show over and over again. That's when I started noticing that my body was starting to hurt. It was my forearms that were starting to get sort of stiff. My wrists were starting to get stiff. I'm a hypochondriac, so I panicked. I went into full-blown panic mode. I'm like, oh my God, this is it. I finally got the gig that I've wanted for years, and now I'm not going to be able to do it anymore. Obviously, that wasn't the case. It was just repetitive strain because my body had never done anything like that before. We'd never done 8 shows a week of a show that was so aggressive on the drum sets. It was a really great introduction to thinking about things in a more ergonomic way and investing in physical therapy, which was so huge. And now I'm such a big... Anyone who's going out on tour, it's the first thing I tell them. It's like, take care of your body. Make sure you go to PT. Make sure you're there. It's such a godsend to have on the road. We would get physical therapy any show day. It's only 20-minute sessions because they were trying to get to everyone. If you needed more, you could request more, but it wasn't guaranteed. Even just having 20 minutes of someone look over you and be like, okay, you're doing well here, you're doing not so well here, here's some stretches, here are some exercises, some strengthening tools. I did that not only all through the tour, but all through the pandemic as well. I used this thing that Tom Jorgensen, another drummer friend of mine, had recommended called a power ball, which was this resistance ball that you spin in your hand and it strengthens your whole arm and forearm muscles. I used a tool to sort of scrape out your muscles. I would go to the gym and do strengthening or like lat pull down so I could like strengthen my back muscles. Again, I could spend the rest of the podcast talking about all of the things I did to build up muscles to protect myself. One of the things that was really helpful was I set up a camera and I watched myself play. I started to look at certain periods and certain things that I was doing that definitely were problematic. I would start to hunch after a while, or if I wasn't sitting right on the stool, I could see myself shifting to one side. My elbow would come up at certain times. It really got me thinking about how I could make the setup in the room a lot easier and more comfortable in my body. All of that stuff really helped keep at bay any type of repetitive strain injuries, which is great.
How did you keep your sanity playing the same thing for so many years? Or did you not mind?
Dear Evan Hansen was such a wonderfully fun show to play on drums that even when it got old, and it definitely did, there were still moments in the show that I was like, okay, this is so much fun. Especially when you really got to the relationships that I would build with our guitar players and our bass players. When things clicked in a certain way and you're hearing things over and over again, it really was like you caught lightning in a bottle and you were just trying to make it sound that way all the time. Sometimes that presented a unique challenge where you're just like, okay, it clicked here and I'm trying to figure out a way to make it click all the time. We did this goofy thing called, I think it started on Broadway, but we kind of took it and ran with it on tour. They called it Tree Jam. In the musical, Dear Evan Hansen, Act 2 opens cold. There's no music playing at all. This show just starts with Alana doing this monologue about raising money for an orchard. The band is hard muted the whole time. With the exception of the strings and acoustic guitar, we are all electric. So somewhere along the line on Broadway, they took to noodling around during this period. We started doing that and then realized how far can we take this and started doing full-on jam sessions.
What?
During the show. I don't know if I'm going to get crucified for this or if Black is listening, but we were very liberal with what and it was actually born out of the fact that Jamie was on stage, so he could play little shaker things along with them, something quiet and gentle. I remember there was one point that we were thrashing till Third Eye Blind during the show while she was doing this monologue, and no one was aware of it. It became a thing where whenever I would have someone come and watch, they were blown away by how much noise we were making and how violent it was out in the audience. How hard we could go on Tree Jam definitely depended on where the drums were in the building. I knew right then and there. I was like, okay, this is not a jam city. Sometimes they would put me in weird places. Like in San Antonio, I was in a theater all to myself. They had a smaller theater that was back to back with the main stage theater. And they just set me up on the stage with the rest of the touring equipment boxes to this empty house. It was the most bizarre thing I've ever done. Just looking out into this empty house. There was a full show going on behind me. It was very strange. But Tree Jam was one of those things that we always looked forward to. There was a hard word we had to stop because they would unmute us. She would say gulp. That was the word. So we would try and land the end of the jam right with her on gulp.
My God.
Those little things that helped make it fun. And as long as we weren't getting anyone into trouble, definitely helped.
Have you, I'm assuming you never went over the word gulp.
That would be a safe assumption. There was one period of time where we were very into the jam and the vocals were getting covered up a bit.
Oh, no.
There was but I mean, and God bless our A1 was just right on top of it. And she knew that we did this. We went to unmute the band, heard a little something and pulled us back. Our conductor was like, stop. Okay. So we might have pushed the bar a little bit.
That's funny. When you were on tour, are you the kind of person who took advantage of seeing a lot of the places where you were a tourist for a little bit, or were you not the kind of person to venture out?
Oh, I very much was. I loved getting to see all of the cities we were in. I wanted to be around experiencing all these things. I remember we were in Memphis, right? And then there's a civil rights museum that they took from the Lorraine Motel where Martin Luther King was assassinated, and it is a beautiful museum. It's very heavy, but I just remember walking over there. I didn't know that this museum existed. I just knew that the hotel was there. So I was like, "Oh, I'm going to walk there and look at a piece of history." And I came there and I found that they had turned it into this whole museum. I spent the entire day just sort of like going through and looking at it. And it's just like, just something kind of crazy just happened upon. And there were so many experiences in different cities where I got a chance to do that. Some other things I like to do, Memphis also comes to mind for this, is to visit drum shops around the country. Memphis has an incredible drum shop, as does Denver. There used to be Vic's in Chicago, the Chicago Drum Exchange. There's the Pro Drum Shop in Hollywood. That's amazing. I mean, there's just so many. A couple in Canada as well. There's Dave's Drum Shop, I think, in Ontario. Those were also things that I like to do. Less of the band liked to come along with me for those particular excursions. I can't imagine why.
You got done with the tour. You moved to New York City. You moved to Brooklyn.
Mhm.
You know, I asked this question because there are younger people that listen to the podcast, and I'm sure they want to know, man, I need to move to New York to play on Broadway. What are some of the things that you'd say to people? If you're going to move to New York, you probably need to know about these particular things, especially as a drummer.
No matter how well connected you are in New York, there's always a period of groundwork that you have to put in to start to meet people and find out who's looking for coverage on different shows. I think being able to support yourself in that period of time is important. Whether it's finding an odd job or having some type of nest egg, everything about New York mounts up very fast in terms of your expenses and even your time. It does take time to go and meet and invest in what's going on in the community. What has helped me is making relationships with different people, connecting with other people in and around the city has been so huge. Even people that I kind of knew somewhat through Instagram, but meeting people in person was huge in New York because it's also enjoyable. I mentioned that I'd known Derek Stoltenberg for a while online, but we really didn't get to meet each other until I moved to New York. Now we spend so much time doing things that don't necessarily have to do with drumming or theater, but that connection is huge because we're constantly looking out for one another in terms of opportunities to work. The drumming community is really great. They're very supportive, at least I found.
When you were looking for a place to stay, were you looking for a place where you could play? And do you find many other drummers can find a place to practice in their apartment buildings or homes?
I think it's unique for the location I'm in. The situation here was something I fell into because one of the guys who was in the band on Dirty Dancing lived in the building already. When I was thinking, where am I going to live when I come back to New York? I mentioned this to him. I said, I don't think I'm going to find a place to play and live at the same time. So I'll probably have to rent out space other than the music building in Midtown or studio space out in Brooklyn. He said, our other roommate, Andrew, is moving out and he has full-on band rehearsals downstairs. When I was out in Southern California, I'd purchased like this sort of drum booth to sort of help keep noise down from my parents. I brought that back to New York and I was thinking, if I put that down there and I soundproof as best I can in the basement, I could probably make it whisper quiet. Then I could practice, play, and have access to a room to record. All of that has been so beneficial. I know it's very unique. Trying to find a place where you can do that. I know they exist. Sometimes if you go far out in Queens or if you live in New Jersey, you can find places where you can play and practice at the same time. But I would almost say Manhattan's a no-go just because you're really on top of everyone. And you might be able to practice with pads, but I subletted a place in the Heights for a little bit and I knew instantly that was not going to be a place where I could play and not get kicked out.
After moving back to New York, did you start subbing on shows, and which ones did you start subbing on?
The only show that I came back right into was Once Upon a One More Time. That was the only thing I had on my radar at that point. And that was great. That was more than almost anyone had coming back from tour. Because when you're on tour, you're out of town for so long. It was kind of a gift just to have something to work on when you're coming back into the cities. I was really grateful to be there, and everyone over there was so nice. Once that show closed, I was doing a lot of not theater subbing gigs. The drumming community is so supportive. Like Dan Berkery had thrown me so many gigs. I did an off-Broadway show of a revival of a show called The Lieutenant with the York Theater Company, which was really cool to be a part of. It was sort of like Jesus Christ Superstar style music, almost to the point where I could sing lyrics of Jesus Christ Superstar over top of. It was a lot of fun. I had a great time with it. I don't know if there's a life for that musical outside of what we did with it, but it was really cool to be a part of that. And Dan also got me involved with this Pops Orchestra, the American Pops Orchestra based in Washington, D.C. They did a lot of really cool things. The first show I did with them, we were in Wall Street, and it was the Global Citizens Awards. I didn't know anything about this at all. They were just like, bring a drum set. It's a Pops Orchestra gig. Here's the music. It's all going to be on iPads. I'm like, great. So I show up there to this fanciest thing I've ever done. I come to find out that the guest speaker that night was Vladimir Zelensky, the president of the Ukraine. I'm thinking, I just wandered in here with a drum kit and no one batted an eyelash. It was a very cool gig to be a part of. The conductor, Luke Frazier, was very nice. I got to do another gig with them. The second one I did was the Global Music Diplomacy Initiative hosted by Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, at the State Department, which was wild. I didn't really know much about it, except that it was a very high-profile gig and that I needed to have passport and be in your best behavior because it was at the State Department. We wound up playing with, backing a lot of the singers there, but the headlining acts were Herbie Hancock and Dave Grohl, just some really heavy hitters. And I'm like, where am I? This just sort of fell into my lap. I did some cool things in between. Thank you, Dan Berkery, if you're listening. That was such a cool gig to be a part of. Another touring drummer, Marco Kane, got me involved with the Ocean City Pops Orchestra down in New Jersey, which was really cool. Playing with an orchestra as a drummer is a different kind of monster. Playing with 60 people instead of, at most 20. You dig into a whole new bag of tricks in terms of skill set when you're trying to figure out how to keep all of that together and then follow a conductor. But I had a great time with that as well. So that was pretty much what I was doing to support myself while I was in Brooklyn for the first couple of months, because I didn't really have anything else besides Britney Spears on the horizon. And when that closed, I went up to the Gunquit Playhouse and covered Tootsie, which was tremendously difficult to play because it's a very swing show. There's a lot of burnin' jazz that comes out of nowhere in that show. I remember when I got the call for that, I'm like, I don't know if I'm the guy for this. But it was a lot of fun to work on, really challenging and rewarding. And the band up there was just so much fun to play with. Those are the first few things that I did. How I got involved with Wicked and Hamilton was kind of wild. I remember I met Matt Vander when I was 15, but I was a kid and I didn't really have, I wasn't regularly staying in touch with everyone. The last time I talked to Matt, I think I was 15, and I'm like, there's going to be no way that this guy remembers me. But Sean had asked me to hold potentially a couple of dates for him in terms of workshops, but he wasn't sure whether that was going to work out or not. And I checked in with him and he said, no, we're good. Did you hear from Matt Vander? I recommended you for Wicked. I haven't talked to Matt since I was a kid. I don't think he'll remember me, but I'll write to him. I got back in touch with Matt and he was so nice. He said, yes, but I'm out of town right now. This is the middle of December. He said, so reach back out towards the end of December and we can get you in. I was like, great. During that time, I also went to watch Sweeney Todd because I heard great things about it. After I left the show, I texted Alex Lacamoire and I said, congratulations. It's such an amazing show. I never really expected to hear from Lack. I knew he was very busy. But he texted back and he's like, oh, I was there tonight. He's like, how are you doing? Is everything going well in New York? I mentioned I'm looking for places to play around town. If you have any recommendations, let me know. And I didn't hear from him for a bit. He said, we would be really great at Wicked if you haven't checked in with them at Wicked yet. I said, funny enough, I have. He said, I don't think Andres is looking for anyone at Hamilton, and I think that Sam is pretty covered over at Anne Juliet. I'll keep you in mind.
So, Sam Merrick, by the way.
Sam Merrick, yeah. Another wonderful drummer. I was in the midst of preparing to go and look at Wicked, and I got a text from an unknown number. Hi, my name is Andres Ferrero. I got your contact info from Alex Lacamoire. He recommended you to me. I don't think I need anyone imminently in terms of coverage, but would you want to come in and watch? And I said, absolutely, just to get a chance to meet Andres and watch the show. As we started, Andres works very fast. He was like, well, how about tonight? And I was like, well, I have a gig tonight, but I can go tomorrow. The next day I heard from him. I went and I watched him play Hamilton, the matinee, and we got to talking and he says, Alex doesn't recommend people a lot. If you want to learn the show and you feel like you're a good fit for this, you should. And I was blown away, but also terrified because I was taking on Wicked as well. The idea of trying to tackle both at the same time was absolutely terrifying. I started with one and then I moved to the other. I knew Andres had more coverage. So I asked for more time to learn the book from Andres. I started with Wicked. And learning both of them together was a trip. So much fun to play Hamilton for very different reasons. I was more stressed at the beginning of this year than I think I've ever been. It was I couldn't think of more supportive people at both orchestras. I mean, they were, I wasn't so sure because they were long running shows and, here's this new guy coming in after all this time. I really wasn't sure what to expect, but they were so nice. It was such a blessing to be at both of them, especially since Wicked was the show that got me into theater in general. Getting a chance to sit and play that show I can't really think of a more full circle moment for me.
Mm. I heard all the drummers that I've talked to on the podcast that have played Wicked and in other shows, I asked them what's the most difficult they played, and they say Wicked. That's why I want to see it and hear how difficult it really is. And so
I think the funny I don't remember whether it was Matt that said this or another, but someone was like, yeah, Wicked is like if you have Bartok meeting prog rock. It's a very orchestral drum set book, but when it's drum set, it is balls to the wall drum set. When it's orchestral, it's very nuanced. So it runs the gamut in terms of utilizing every skill set that you have, which was great to have a background in classical percussion to tackle Wicked, because there are a lot of elements that help you, for the most part, not clicked. You have to really know how to watch and know exactly what the conductor is looking for. Dear Evan Hansen was mostly clicked, so it was a very different approach to making sure that you were locked in and in the right tempo and not pushing, because my tendency when I get very nervous is to rush, and I'm aware of that, even if it's a very hard thing to stop when you're very nervous. But there are a lot of different hits and a lot of different tempo changes and stylistic changes that sort of come out of nowhere with Wicked. And even if you know the show really well, it's just one that every time I've gone in there to play it, it just feels tremendously challenging, but very rewarding to play. I don't think I've even come close to playing a perfect show.
Mm-mm. All right, now I got to reach out to Matt. I got to see this thing. Plus, I got to see the show from the audience, too.
It really is an extraordinary show. I don't think I've ever been a part of something quite like it. Hamilton the same way, just for very different reasons. The tricky thing about Hamilton is that it doesn't stop. When you find something that didn't go the way you want it to in Hamilton, there's no time to grieve over your mistake because you have to keep moving on. You get one look in the camera where you didn't land something correctly, or it's just off a little bit with the conductor. It's like you're frustrated, but you hear that click come in and you just got to keep going. But again, I can't imagine feeling like more of a badass than playing Hamilton. It's pretty wild to be a part of.
Few more questions for you. What are some do's and don'ts for drummers that want to move to New York and play on Broadway?
I think that one of the things that I really feel very strongly about is being kind. I know that sounds a little vague, but I think it's so important. I hear a lot of people working on skill sets on drums, and I think that being a competitive drummer and sharpening your skill set as a musician is incredibly important because the competition level in New York is so high. But I think equally as important is having a really good handle on people skills. That's what I value a lot when I meet and work with people. I had a conversation that was really flattering during intermission at Wicked. I was just going down to collect some notes between the show, and I remember having a nice conversation with some of the piano players in the room, and one of them says to me, just out of nowhere, he's like, "You're like a really kind person, aren't you? You're like just really nice." And I didn't really know how to respond to that, except to say like, "Oh, thank you. I try very hard to be." And but it got me thinking just how nice it was to feel that was the type of energy that you bring into a place, because I think that is really important. So definitely being a kind person, because it is such a stressful environment. So much of music is social, and when you're going into something over and over again, like a Broadway show where it can seem kind of monotonous, it can almost feel robotic, where you come and you do the show, you leave. And even more subs who've been playing a show for a long time, it can almost come off that way. Just being genuine and kind in a certain way can kind of go a long way in really making a difference positively for them, and then just making an impression in terms of like, I would like to work with that person because they're a really kind person.
If you were to pick a perfect drum set, cymbals, heads, drums, hardware, throne, what would it be?
Oh gosh. Well, I sort of grew up between two different companies, Yamaha and the other being Pearl. And and I've loved working on them. And I still have two. I still have a Yamaha kit and a Pearl kit, but I fell in love with the kit we had on Dear Evan Hansen. At that point, it was the nicest instrument I'd ever played on. I had been working on mid-range kits for most of my career, and I say that with no shade to the mid-range kits. I think they're amazing, and they got the job done. But when we got to Dear Evan Hansen, Mike Aaron said, "We're going to get you a drum kit. I have a relationship with Pearl. Would a Pearl reference be okay?" Of course. I remember watching videos of Dennis Chambers and Omar Hakim playing these drums when they came out. I remember just watching them over and over again. I knew all about the fact that they were blending woods together and the bearing edges were different. I was like, this is going to be so cool to play on this instrument for real. But I did wonder, am I going to hear the difference? Am I going to notice a difference? I was kind of shocked when I went into the space and first played them. Like, I do notice a difference. These are really good instruments. The other thing about that kit that I absolutely loved is that it owed us nothing after 5 years. It was beat by this aggressive drum set book for 5 years and took such a beating. And it was rock solid. It never once failed me. The hardware never once failed me. I was very attached to that set, so much so that I wanted to buy it from them when the tour ended. They wouldn't sell it to me because they sold it to Crossroads for the second national tour. They just sold the whole thing as a package. I was devastated that they sold the kit. I really wanted it because it was such a huge part of my journey with that show. If I had an opportunity to play on any kit, it would be that one. After 5 years of working on that and knowing just how rock solid and dependable they are, those are the ones that I like the best, the Pro reference.
If somebody wants to reach out to you and get in contact with you or find out more about you, what would they need to do?
I think the easiest way would be to go to Instagram. I'm on there pretty regularly. I don't post an awful lot, but I'm definitely active on there. So it's just my name and drums, so Ryan McCausland drums on Instagram. That would be the easiest way for someone who I don't know at all to get in touch with me. I also have a website, which is just my name, ryanmccausland.com. I am not as active on the website, but you can definitely get in touch with me there. It has my email on there as well. So that would be the two best ways to get in touch with me.
One last question, I guess. Would you go on another tour if somebody asked you to?
I actually get this question a lot. I would never say no to touring, but it would have to be the right tour. I went out and covered for Kevin McNaughton on the Mamma Mia tour recently. It was so much fun to go out and play on the road again. We were in Detroit, which I'd been to a handful of times. I was only out there for the weekends. It wasn't a very long time, but I remember it was almost like a very sort of surreal experience. I got out there. We were staying in the same hotel that we stayed in for Dear Evan Hansen. We were at the same theater we were at for Dear Evan Hansen, and all of those memories of tour came flooding back. And I remember thinking to myself, the vast majority of it was so good. Even on a non-equity tour, the vast experiences that I had, I could group it with cruising as well. There's a net positive experience. You get to play music for a living. At the end of the day, it's kind of extraordinary when you think about it. I get to do what I love and do that for a living. I have gotten a chance to do that for so long. There are so many things that you could list as drawbacks to that in terms of the sacrifices that you have to make and the things that music demands of you, because it does demand everything. And I think that's one thing I wasn't rightly prepared for from the get-go, was just that eventually a career in Broadway or even in music in general will ask you for everything at a certain point. And that can be a really hard position to be in. But it's also nice to think of the opposite side of the coin, which is an extraordinary life that you get to live playing music. And as much as I've had to give up, the decisions that I've made were not always easy. I wouldn't change it.
With that said, I'm going to close this interview on a positive note. No, seriously, I totally agree with you. I feel the same way. Sometimes when I'm on a show, I have to pinch myself. Like, I can't believe I do this for a living. It's I don't take it for granted. I'm looking to do other things now that I'm older and I'm towards other things during the latter 42 years of my life that I have left. I appreciate all the good things that have happened so far. And I wish you the best in starting out on this career path. I hope you eventually land your own show, which I'm sure you will sooner than later, because your talent level is that high. You're a great person, and I'm sure things will happen.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you for being a part of this podcast, and it's great to get to know you and hang out for a little bit. It's good to meet you, and hopefully we'll actually meet in person sooner than later.
Definitely, yeah. Well, thank you so much again, Clayton. I appreciate it. It means a lot.
No problem, man. I will talk to you soon. I will somehow find a way to connect with you in Midtown. Talk to you soon.